All right. I'm officially recording, so I'll stop talking about how online education is a horrible mess. But I will show you the book. So this is my version of the book. I may have shown you this last time and I just don't remember, but this is the 6th edition. The 5th edition looks a lot like this, only it's orange, I think. And I think either will probably be okay. I was looking at the 6th edition versus the 5th edition for chapter 15. They look super similar. So I think the big differences are going to be toward the end, especially the last chapter where they add the Trump section, which I'm going to be honest, I haven't read the Trump section yet, but I'm super curious what Dr. Foner has to say about Trump, because I think, well, he teaches at Columbia University, so he probably has, you know, the New York background as well. So that would be interesting to me, at least. And then if you ever wonder, like, is your author biased? You know, every author is. Every person in the world has a bias, of course. But you can usually tell when you read about stuff you know about, and then you can kind of see their opinion in how they write. So if Dr. Foner's biased, I think he's a pretty good, solid, middle-of-the-road historian, I think. You'll see it more in the later stuff when they talk about presidents you know and like or know and dislike. And you'll probably be able to tell a little if they agree with you. All right. People were asking questions like, what supplies do you need for class? Yeah, I bet a computer would help. But you guys have already figured that out. A textbook for sure. Whether you use the online, you use the link to the free one that I gave you. You got a physical textbook, but give me liberty, not just any textbook, the right textbook. And I would take notes probably while I read or during the lectures. And today's kind of like a preview, I suppose, a little bit of the lecture, but maybe not the typical one. I did finally, kind of late, put my notes online, and it should be in the documents page, course documents page, and it'll say something like Unit 1 Notes, Chapter 15 through 17, something like that. And so those are the notes that I'll use during the lectures. You're welcome to download those and add to them, print them, and write on the, you know, whatever you think is useful. And you've already figured out that for college classes, you have to figure out what's useful for you. And you've been in school long enough to know that we don't all learn the same way. And, you know, some people are really good at remembering stuff and they only have to read it once. Some people come in knowing stuff, which is sort of weird, but it happens. You know, with math and science concepts, some of you learn those faster. Some of you have to really work at those, just the way the world works. So some of you are going to have to study for hours. Some of you will just have to read stuff once. Some of you maybe can hear it and remember it, because everybody's brain works a different way. So for me, what I would do if I were you in this class, and what I did when I was in college 8 million years ago, is I would do the reading and then take a few notes as I went, write down stuff that I thought was important. The way that you'll know what's important, because that's tricky, especially if you don't know anything about history. And I don't mean that in a rude way. We're all learning stuff, you know, when we learn it. So you have either a smaller or larger base of knowledge for this. So if you don't know what's important, really good clues would be, what is the weekly question? So the weekly question for this chapter is, was Reconstruction a success or not? A success or failure? And, you know, the answer on those kind of questions is always yes. Sort of a success and sort of a failure. So maybe as you're taking notes on this chapter, you write down things like a little T chart, if you like. T chart, yeah, I made a T for you. And on one side, write down the stuff that you think was a success and the stuff that you think was a failure. And there'll be times when that'll be, you know, some of the things are both a success and a failure. You put them in both columns. But I would also put why, because you know that your answer can't just be a list. And then tomorrow I will post a list of things you should study for the online quiz, which happens somewhere between the 16th, 17th, and 18th. You choose the time. Hopefully, if I load it properly, it'll go live on the 16th. And you just have to do that all in one sitting, and I will talk more about that as it gets closer. But I would also study, make notes about those things as well. So for this class, and because it's sort of a weird online format and I've modified how I'm assessing you, you should have pretty much all the clues you need to tell you what's important. So hopefully that'll help. But I definitely read the book. I would take notes about things that I thought were important. And then during the lectures, I would probably take some notes. And the reason I would take some notes is to keep you involved, to make sure you're paying attention to the lecture. Because you can open 5 screens and do other things. Or if you're like me, like you've got your phone next to you, which I do, which I just turned over because 3 people texted me. And it's like, yeah, I don't need to know that until my class is over. You know what I'm saying? So you got to eliminate your distractions, and maybe you taking notes will help you eliminate some distractions. You know what I'm saying? Okay. All right. All right. Is there anything? I know I didn't really say anything profound, but okay, there's a chat question. Let's see. The link to the online textbook. Huh. I think that was in an announcement, and it's definitely in the syllabus. I also put in the group chat a link to the book review video where I just talk about the video, or excuse me, I just talk about the book review. I made that over the summer, and the only reason that matters to you is I start off talking about how many points it's worth and how many points are possible in the class. And there was a different point total available for my summer class. So I think one of the first things I say in that video is there's 400 points available in the class. For your class, there's only 300 because I revised it, which I don't know if it's better or worse or harder or easier. I don't know. Okay, I just don't know. So I wasn't trying to make it harder, I guarantee you. Just trying to make it simpler to understand, if that makes any sense. Okay. All right, I think I've answered the questions in the chat. All right, so we'll get back to business. So talked about the book, talked about stuff you might need. I would definitely read the chapters. Also, you may or may not have noticed, you don't have to notice yet, but there's 3 weekly questions for the first unit because there's 3 chapters. There's 1 per chapter. I've given you a list of all 3 of those in the course documents page, but on the assignments page, they're listed individually, so you turn them in individually. They're all officially due the same day as the quizzes due, which is that Friday in September, I believe is the 18th, but you can turn those in whenever you want. If I were you, and please don't take this the wrong way, I'm not trying to be rude at all, but you have a lot of stuff to do. And for a variety of reasons, when you're younger, it's sometimes harder to focus on the task at hand. And when you're in college, you typically take 4 to 5 classes. You guys probably have 7 to 8 right now. Plus, pandemic, and you might be looking over your 3 little brothers, and wouldn't that be fun? And you got stuff to do. And you might even have a job too. And are they making you march for marching band? Hopefully they're giving you a break from that. Probably not, knowing band directors. You got a lot of stuff to do. If you wait till the last minute to do all 3 questions plus the quiz, guess what you're going to be doing till midnight? And you'll start it like at 10 o'clock and you'll do a terrible job. Not because you're terrible, but because you put it off till the last minute. And maybe you put it off because you got too many things to do. I get it. But if I were you, I would do a question a week because that takes a little bit of stress off of you. So that's what I would do if I were you. That's also part of the reason that I listed them individually and gave them 3 separate due dates. So, or not 3 separate due dates, but 3 separate assignment sections. So if I were you, I'd do 1 question a week, starting next week with question 1. Also, next week our classes will focus quite a bit on question 1. So that will help you get that done, hopefully. Hopefully, yeah. And it'll be fresh in your mind, that sort of thing. So if I'm you, 1 question a week. That's not a requirement because you can turn them all in at the end. But if I were you, 1 question a week. All right. I think that's everything I need to tell you that's not about the actual assignment, or I mean the actual chapter. All right. Anything you want to ask or say before we start talking about Reconstruction a little bit? No, yes, maybe. All right. Wow, I have a variety of things I could share there. Let's go with the notes. Yeah. All right. There we go. So these are the notes that I posted today. I tried to put them at the top of the course documents page, but I really don't know where they ended up. The last class told me they were the last thing, so sorry. But it should be on there somewhere. So. And I think it'll say Unit 1, Lecture Notes, Chapter 15 through 17, something along those lines. Right, so Reconstruction, the chapter, we'll just talk about these first few notes, like the first page. And then next class, we'll talk, about the rest of the stuff, which I'm scrolling through right now. And then our main focus for next week will be, was Reconstruction a success or failure, which is handy because, that's your question. All right, so when we talk about Reconstruction, it's the time period after the Civil War, but before the Gilded Age. So it's 1865 to 1877, and there's a very distinct end to this time period, which we'll talk about Monday probably, or not Monday, sorry, Tuesday, maybe Thursday, but probably Tuesday. And the distinct beginning, of course, is the end of the Civil War, which, as you're guessing, ends in 1865. Yes, it does. All right, and we'll start just with a really super basic, generic overview of the Civil War. Now, this is not on the test or the quiz. This is not really part of your answer about Reconstruction, but it does kind of help just to make sure we're all on the same page about the Civil War. Okay, so Civil War, 1861 to 1865. Yes, the document that I am sharing should be, somebody's asking, document I'm sharing should be in the course documents page, I think. So, all right, I'm assuming you guys can hear. I don't know, I'm sorry. Okay, course documents page, hopefully at the top. And usually if I'm sharing a document, I will put it on the course documents page. I know that sounds silly when I say it out loud, but you know what I'm trying to say. All right. So, Civil War. All right. I think it's tricky when you're in high school. Well, that's a dumb statement. Everything's tricky when you're in high school, I suppose. It's kind of fun, but kind of tricky too. Because you haven't really had much modern US history, post-Civil War history. And you probably talked about the Civil War in 8th grade. And because it was middle school, you probably had that teacher where you acted stuff out and did history alive stuff. Like when I taught, I taught at Cedar Park High School. When I taught at Cedar Park High School, the kids would always have some teacher where they had history alive stuff, and they would do demonstrations or protests, and they would say, like, I remember the day that we made fake poop and threw it at each other. And they're super excited about the fake poop. Or they would say, I remember the day that we all pretended we were on a slave ship. That was really fun. And then I would tell them, I don't mean to be disrespectful to your 8th grade teacher, but if your takeaway from being on the slave ship is it was fun, something went wrong that day. So I usually had, and it didn't really, it's just that's what kids remember because that's fun. But I always had a big group of students who had an 8th grade history teacher who was very assertive about the idea the Civil War was not about slavery. Okay. that it was states' rights. And then I would ask, okay, I would say, okay, that's cool. What right did they think the state should have that they weren't getting from the federal government? What was the federal government trying to control that they didn't want it to control? And they would go, slavery. Okay, then, slavery. So the Civil War has a lot to do with slavery. I know some of you are going like, no, no, there's tariffs. Do you really think we would have fought a civil war over tariff policy? You know we would not. Don't be like that. Okay, so slavery is a big deal, whether you agree it's the only deal or not. It is a big deal and a big part of the reason that we had the Civil War, because people in the South wanted slavery and people in the North did not. I'm not going to be a person that would argue that made the North more moral than the South, because the North at this point, you know, they were either farmers, like a lot of folks in the South, or they were business owners, and some of the business owners got immigrants to work for them and mistreated immigrants. So there's not a chance that I would tell you that the folks in the North had a whole lot of moral objection to slavery. It's just that's not the system they used. Now, you know as well as I do that there were some people who had moral objections to slavery, and fortunately for US history, those guys were in charge of stuff during this time period, stuff being the Republican Party. And the main guy that was in charge of the Republican Party ran for president in 1860, which turned out to change history quite a bit, a guy named Abraham Lincoln. So Abraham Lincoln runs for president. People in the South were very opposed to Abraham Lincoln because he didn't like slavery. And he said that he would not preserve slavery or allow, he said essentially he wouldn't allow slavery to spread into new territories, which the South saw as the beginning, rightly saw as the beginning of the end of slavery. Plus, you know, the truth is you had world history last year. Most countries were getting rid of slavery by this point in history, had already gotten rid of slavery, or just about to have a pretty big uprising if they didn't get rid of slavery. So this is the era where people were getting rid of slavery. So the United States getting rid of slavery. So the Republican Party says they would not favor the spread of slavery, and the Democrats say some different stuff. Folks in the South decide it'd be safer if they just don't even allow Abraham Lincoln to be on the ballot. So Abraham Lincoln doesn't get votes in the South, and the South says, if you guys elect him, then we're out of here. And they elect him, and then the South was out of there. You had secession. I know there was a fort and some other stuff that went on. Okay, so the way things go for the Civil War, the first couple of years, the South wins most of the battles because they probably had better military leadership. As time goes along, the North figures out who the best generals are in their army to put in charge of stuff. The North has more people, more stuff, so more people, more money, more. They have an established government. They have relationships with foreign countries. They have a navy, which comes in handy, so they can blockade trade for the South. They also have a more diverse economy. It's a largely agricultural-based economy. However, they have more factories than the North. For whatever reason, people sort of grow up thinking that the South is where all the food is produced, and the North is where it's just like all factories. It's like 80 million factories, and then the South is just a bunch of farms. Okay, that's not true. Sorry. There aren't that many factories in the United States during this time period because it's the early part of the American Industrial Revolution. That's going to really take off after the Civil War. And I know world history last year, you know that the Industrial Revolution really begins in England and France, kind of, across the English Channel, and that happens right around this time, 1830s, 1840s. They do it a little sooner. We'll steal the technology, and then after the Civil War, we'll kind of get started on it ourselves in a big way. So we're importing lots of stuff still during this time period. But during the Civil War, we'll start to manufacture more of our own thing. And after the Civil War, it really takes off. But more of the manufacturing happens in the North than the South. The South is an agriculturally based economy, no doubt, almost exclusively. However, they don't grow all of their own food. This is going to be a problem during the Civil War because you always need food. And if the half of the country that produces most of the food is the half of the country you're not in, guess what you're not going to have enough of? So by the middle of the war, the South is running out of food because they primarily grow cotton and you can't eat that stuff. They also were in the habit of exporting their cotton to England and France, which is much harder to do when the northern part of your country has now blockaded all of your ports, so you can't get the stuff in and out. So they were smuggling cotton to the north so that textile mills there could buy it, or they could sell it overseas. And they didn't start growing food, which would have been helpful. All right, so by the middle of the Civil War, the North is starting to gain an advantage because they've outlasted the South. The North doesn't run out of stuff. The North has more people. The North has a broader economy, so they're not feeling inflation as badly. Their government's holding together better because it's older, it's had more practice, and the South's running out of food. And people are starting to abandon their posts in the military and try to go home to make sure their family has enough food or that they're safe. So the North starts winning battles in the middle of the Civil War. And then as time goes along, it becomes very, very clear the North is going to win. In the middle of the Civil War, when the tide really changes, where it's clear the North has an advantage, you see a couple of important things happen, important speeches. You have the Emancipation Proclamation, where Lincoln proclaims that all the slaves in the Southern territories are free. And you probably talked about that in 8th grade, and you noticed that if the Southern territories aren't technically observing Abraham Lincoln as their president, Lincoln probably didn't officially free anybody. And that Lincoln didn't free any of the slaves in the border states, the part of the Union, you know, right between the North and the South. I always leave out a border state, but let me try. Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri. Ooh, I think I got them all because there's only 4. So those are states that are part of the Union but still have slaves. Lincoln doesn't free those slaves. But it's more than just a political statement. Somebody in the last class said, didn't he do that for economic reasons? Yeah, partly. Because the thought was when slaves heard that they were free, they would leave the plantations, and that would cause economic problems for the South. And that did occur in some instances. And I don't know if you've been paying attention to the news all summer, but if you're from Texas or have lived in the South a good part of your life, you'd heard of Juneteenth before, most likely, which is when states in the South, primarily Texas, June 19th was Juneteenth. Where Texas officially hears that slaves are freed, and so that's celebrated as kind of a state holiday, which I expect will turn into a national holiday in the next few years, probably. But it takes a while for the news to get to the South. And when that news does get here, sometimes slaves did leave their plantations, but the big effect you saw in the North was that African Americans, free blacks in the North, saw that and they went, that's cool. We have a government who wants to end slavery. So you know what we're going to do? Join the military. So they did. So you have an influx of between 150 and 200,000 new troops in the middle of the Civil War, which does make a difference. And while sometimes they're not allowed to fight in combat situations, eventually they are. And that, I mean, a whole bunch of new troops in the middle of a war is a huge deal. So that's very helpful. And the North also begins to free the slaves in the border states. So by the time the Civil War is over, there are no slaves in the North, and the 13th Amendment has been passed, so there can't be slaves in the South. Also, almost all of the damage, economic damage, but also physical damage of the Civil War occurs in the South. So the South's economy collapses, plus almost everything that gets blown up in the South. And while casualty numbers are legitimately higher in the North has twice as many people. So the percentage of people who die in the South because of the Civil War is bigger. So and their inflation rates are much higher because they started a new currency, which is now worthless, the Confederate, yeah, that's what they call it, the Confederate. So the South is devastated at the end of the Civil War. Not only did they lose, they got blown up, they lost a large percentage of their young male population, and their economy's in the shambles. So Abraham Lincoln, being Abraham Lincoln, decides that it's probably not worth punishing the South any more than just losing. So what he decides makes sense is to kind of reconstruct the Union in as charitable ways possible. And he'll give a lovely speech, the second inaugural, I think the greatest speech in US history. But also he does an unusual thing and picks a very unusual person for his vice president. Now, probably just like me, you were watching the Republican convention last night. Now, to be fair, I don't want you to worry. I watched the Democrats last week. I watch all the stuff because, you know, I'm a history teacher. So I'm watching the Republicans last night, and here comes Mike Pence. Mike Pence is the vice president, for those of you who are not aware. And then Mike Pence is like the most religious, conservatively religious guy that we've had in political office, in national political office in a really long time. So he's one of those guys that I think the most, I don't know the peculiar, I'll say peculiar, and I'm not trying to be unkind. It is an unusual rule. The most peculiar thing about Mike Pence, maybe, is that he won't be alone in a room with a woman who's not his wife. So if there's a head of state who's female, he'll make sure that he has an assistant who's in the room or a translator that's male. So he won't be alone with a woman for religious reasons. If you know very much about Donald Trump, he has a different policy. We'll just go with that. So when Mike Pence is giving his speech last night, I'm thinking to myself, when have we had such polar opposites as president and vice president before? And, you know, I thought about a couple of times LBJ and JFK, maybe FDR and Truman, but Johnson and Lincoln, the ones we're just about to talk about. Okay, so what makes them very different, aside from their background does, but Lincoln is a Republican. He's the Republican, the original Republican president, and his vice president dies, Hannibal Hamlin. So he's got to replace him. And he decides to replace him with Andrew Johnson, who is a Southern Democrat. A Southern Democrat. That was a weird thing because the Democrats in the South, they seceded. The reason that Abraham Lincoln picks Andrew Johnson is because he is the only Southern Democrat who opposed secession. So when his state said, we're leaving the Union, he said no. Tennessee, by the way. And he continued to attend the Senate through the entire Civil War. So Lincoln is doing two things by picking Andrew Johnson. He's rewarding Andrew Johnson for his loyalty to the Union, for saying, no, I don't want to drop out of the Union. The second thing that he's doing is he's telling the South, we still want you as part of our country. We are not going to punish you anymore. The war has done that for you. And that second inaugural speech gives you a lot of insight into that as well. But the thought is, you're going to be part of the country again. You're going to help govern. That'll be fun. Okay. Now, if you're wondering, how dumb is it? If you're wondering, how dumb is it to have somebody from the opposite party as you, as vice president? It's only dumb if something happens to you. Well, who knew that Lincoln was going to get assassinated? Typically, we don't even know who the vice president is. I have a pretty good idea that some of you were unaware of who Mike Pence was. And I get that because, you know, he's not super famous. Excuse me for that. Typically, the vice president doesn't do much. They break ties in the Senate, they attend funerals, they go to meetings the president doesn't want to go to. So they don't do a whole lot of stuff. And normally you never hear about them. But because Abraham Lincoln gets assassinated, we end up with Andrew Johnson as president. I'd already mentioned he's a Democrat. He's also pro-slavery. Now, he had grown up a poor guy, and his famous quote about slavery was that every white family in America should have a slave to relieve the drudgery of daily life. So his problem with slavery wasn't that it existed, it was that not enough people had slaves. He thought rich people hoarded all the slaves and that poor white people should also be able to have slaves. This is probably not going to be the best guy to be in charge during the Civil War. And it turns out he wasn't, probably. Now, there's certain things that, you know, when I look back at this, I think, I bet only Lincoln could have helped us through this. But Johnson was definitely not the guy, because he didn't think slavery was wrong. And, you know, a lot of the new legislation that passes in his term and right before his term are about slavery and equality for former slaves, which he's not in favor of. So he's, yeah, interesting guy to be in charge during this time period. All right, you guys have questions? Anybody want to say anything before we look more specifically at these notes? You guys are still there though, right? Still there?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Okay. I need to be like your high school students and you have to show your faces all the time, but I don't know. I don't know.
Wait, I have a question.
Okay. Go ahead.
Was one of the reasons why he picked the vice president to sort of calm down the relations between the North and the South?
Yes, I think so. I think that's it, yes. Yep. You're what? You're confused. Okay.
I have a question also. Sorry.
Okay, that's all right. Let's hear it.
So why was it a bad idea to have, like, why is it a bad thing whenever the Republican president died and then the Democratic vice president was still there?
Well, I'm not saying it would always be. Oh, there's somebody who's coming into our class that isn't in our class. Should we let him in? Let's do it.
Sure.
Maybe. Okay. All right. You guys keep an eye on them if they do something. Okay. All right. Why is it a bad idea? Okay. In this instance, I'm not saying it always would be, but typically when you pick a vice president, there's somebody from your party because you agree on stuff. And because they're your vice president, they, in theory, would take over. It was just in theory during this time period because we didn't pass the amendment yet that said who took over when, you know, the president died. Because not too many presidents had died, to be honest, during this time period or before this time period. So usually you want to pick somebody who's from your party and thinks the same way you do. And the reason this wasn't good is Lincoln's the guy who wants to end slavery. He's picked a vice president that thinks slavery is a great idea. So when Lincoln dies, the guy who's in charge of making sure that former slaves are treated fairly, is a guy, sorry, someone else is coming in, is a guy who thinks that everyone should own a slave. So you go from the guy who frees the slaves to the guy that wishes everybody owned the slaves. And that's sort of messy.
Oh, okay, but I thought he's only temporarily present until next person.
Well, that's true. Unfortunately for U.S. history and slaves, former slaves, Lincoln gets shot the week after he's inaugurated.
Oh,
so
okay.
This is going to be 4 years of Andrew Johnson. There's definitely no more years of Andrew Johnson. He'll get impeached, not convicted, but oh my goodness, yeah, his presidency is a huge mess. It is. So I think normally it's not terrible that you end up with the vice president as president, except you know, someone died for that to happen probably, or maybe someone quit. We had one president quit later on, but yeah, normally I don't think it would be terrible. In this instance, because they're so different, it is a problem. Are you guys just inviting random people to come to the meetings? You guys sending the Zoom meeting link out to all your friends? Because I'm starting to think you are, aren't you? You want your whole family in here. That's what it is. You guys have questions before I go on? I'll share the notes again, but before we go on to the notes. And we have about not too many minutes left, maybe 20? No, not quite 20, 15 maybe? 15. All right, so no questions. You're scared now, aren't you? Because I'll probably yell at you. I yell at people all the time. It's crazy. All right. All right, so here we have the official notes. So this is just like the first introductory part of chapter 15. So if you haven't gotten your book yet, it's okay. Okay, it's okay. However, get your book, and next week we're going to officially work on the question for chapter 15, which of course was Reconstruction a success or a failure? All right. So Reconstruction is bringing the North and the South back together, in addition to being the time period when we brought the North and South back together. Okay, and we've already talked about a lot of this stuff, I think. The South is devastated after the Civil War. So their land has been torn up, their economy is destroyed, and their population has changed. A lot of people have died, plus you know that the major labor source on plantations, some other places too, but plantations for sure, was slave labor. And slavery is ended. So their system of labor is going to necessarily change. So the economy had been based on cotton sales, which aren't going to happen in quite the same way. Most of the cotton sales to England and France are over. England and France are not going to switch back to US cotton because they can get cotton. My gosh. Sorry. No, there's somebody else coming in. We've got to figure out, I'm sorry, this is not anything related to the Reconstruction, but I'm just going to say this and then we'll figure this out later, because like 3 or 4 of you have come in today that I think weren't here last time. So I'm supposed to tell you, we talked about this last time, you can only be in this class if you're a high school student. So if you're not a high school student and you got in here somehow, they're probably going to kick you out. But we'll take care of that later. You can email me, that sort of thing. And if you crazy high school kids are just sharing the link with all your friends, cut it out. Cut it out. Okay. All right. Back to Reconstruction. Sorry, crazy high school kids. Cotton. Oh yeah, England and France aren't buying U.S. cotton anymore because it's cheaper to buy the Egyptian cotton. They're buying it from Egypt, India, maybe Venezuela. But part of the reason it's cheaper is, you know, England. They've taken over a lot of those places now, so they may not necessarily be buying it. Okay. I feel like, oh, okay. I'm sorry. Someone else is trying to enter the room and they can't. We can't do that. So
don't let them.
I'm not. I'm sorry. I'm telling them they have to go.
Just kick out the guys that you don't know. Can you do that?
Yeah, I'll probably do that in the future. Although, yeah, we should kick that person out, shouldn't we? So you guys are just making up stupid names, aren't you? Yes. Dang it. I'm trying to teach history here and you guys are making up stupid names. Dang it. If I find out who you are, I'm going to kick you out. No, I'm going to flunk you forever. Okay. The notes are in, yeah, thank you. You guys are doing it. The notes are in the course documents page. So, okay. All right. I'm going to ignore anybody else's stupid name if they have it, and then in the future we'll just not. So sorry to be distracted by that. Dang it, high school kids. All right, back to business. You know what's worse than high school kids? The Civil War. The Civil War is worse. And the South lost their market for cotton. Okay. Southern labor force is going to change because now maybe plantation owners and their families are going to work. But truth, when slaves get freed, they don't have any money. So they can't go anywhere. They don't have houses. They don't have tools to do their jobs. So part of what they're going to do is work for their former owners again. And their former owners are going to say stuff like, hey, we know you don't have a place to live and you can't pay rent. So you can just stay in your old slave quarters and we'll take the rent out of your future pay. And we know you need to work, but you don't have any tools. So we'll rent you the tools until you get paid. And so by the time they don't get paid till the crops come in, so they're going to actually charge them interest as well on the money that they loaned them to pay for their rent and their tools. So by the time they get paid, they're already in debt again. So most of the former slaves end up working for their former slave owners, and they kind of recreate a system that looks a lot like slavery. And they'll pass laws that say if you're in debt, you can't work for someone else until you pay off the debt. So it's going to be, you know, messy. We'll just go with that. We'll talk more about that next time. Federally financed reconstruction does occur to an extent. So the federal government, the North, is going to spend money rebuilding, physically rebuilding streets and bridges. Excuse me, I'm sorry. And buildings and things like that in the South. And they will give government contracts to companies that do that. Many of those contracts will go to companies from the North, some of them to companies from the South. Now, scalawags and carpetbaggers are nicknames for some of those people who got those contracts. Scalawags are Southerners, so the two S's might help you. Scalawags are Southerners who got those contracts, and carpetbaggers are Northerners. They called them carpetbaggers because that was a suitcase during that time period. So it means that they came from somewhere else. Carpetbag is, you know, the sign that you traveled. So scalawag is just sort of like a general scoundrel, I suppose. And people really resented other Southerners who now were cooperating with the evil Northern government. And carpetbaggers, you just saw them as outsiders who wanted to change your way of life. So the way the Texans look at Californians who moved in, perhaps, I don't know. And no offense to you at all if you're from California. I'm originally from Missouri, so, you know, I'm not judging. Changes that occurred for former slaves. One of the most important successful things that happened because or through the federal government was the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau. And freedmen, of course, former slaves, and the Bureau is the government agency. And they were supposed to do a few major things. One of them was redistribute land from former plantations. This does not happen in any meaningful way. It does happen in a few plantations in South Carolina and Georgia, but once Johnson becomes president, that land is returned to the former plantation owners and the former slaves remain landless. And if you were to ever ask me what I thought was the biggest failure of Reconstruction, I would say this is it, that former slaves are freed without any resources at all. Because the thought had been that when you freed the slaves, you would divide up the plantation and give the slaves parts of the plantation so they'd have land to farm. But that didn't happen. So people who had never been paid and had worked their whole lives were now free but had no resources. And because the same had been true of their parents and grandparents, no one in their family had any resources. The Freedmen's Bureau would also reunite slave families that had been separated. And they would also teach former slaves basic literacy. So to make sure they could read and write well enough to read a contract, a bill of sale, that kind of stuff, do basic business. And they were pretty successful, Freedmen's Bureau, at these two things. There's some medical care that's provided for former slaves, but it's really more like just cleanliness and public sanitation, that sort of stuff, making sure the water's flowing so you don't get a disease from it, that you have an outhouse, that, you know, that there's a place where you go to the bathroom where it isn't going to cause illness, that sort of thing. All right, and amendments. So for the amendments, make sure that you're aware of these. This is where we'll start next time, the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments. You're making me think that I probably need to share this in a slightly different way, but I know that we're almost out of time. So I'm going to stop sharing, and then we'll start with the amendments next time. All right, now before you go, of course, in the future, I'll be smarter and not let in people who come in late. But if we can not, I know it's the end of the day, you guys are probably tired as well. But if we could not make up ridiculous names, because then it makes me feel like I'm teaching high school all over again. And I don't know if I'm okay with the flashback, you know? You know what I'm saying? Yeah. It's like you asked to go to the bathroom and you're gone for 30 minutes and come back with food. Yeah, that's not cool. All right, so before we go, oh, and I recorded that too. Isn't that nice? I'm going to stop recording. Okay.